What's the new inspiring vision that we're giving to boys and young men for how to be a man in today's world? There isn't one. And so as a result, no script. You're having to improvise. It's very difficult. You're kind of lost. And at worst, a lot of young men today say that they know what not to be, but very few people are telling them what to be and what to do. And that creates a huge appetite, I think, for formation, for guidance, which is leading a lot of men online. And it's leading a lot of them to some pretty dark places, as well as to some pretty great places.
I was talking to a couple of youth pastors not long ago, and we found that although we had a lot of agreement on theological things and ministry things, one point of disagreement came up. One of the youth pastors said, I can see in my youth group that the guys are doing okay, but the girls are really, really in crisis. And the other said, well, in my youth group, the girls are doing fine. It's the guys who are not thriving and who are drifting socially, spiritually, academically, in terms of not open rebellion, but in terms of loneliness, social media addiction, porn addiction, lack of motivation. And the two of them started talking about the unique stresses happening with the young women and the young men, and they both had a compelling case as to what's happening right now. And so I have been thinking for a long time about how should we start thinking about this issue of boys and men. Part of that is being the dad of five sons. Part of that is just looking around, seeing what's happening in the church and looking at some of these cultural trends. And there's nobody that I look to more often on these issues than Richard Reeves. You may have read his book of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Former President Barack Obama included that on his summer reading list a few years ago, I think in 2022. But Richard's the founding president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. And he's devoted his time and energy to evidence-based research on what actually are boys and men really facing. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he writes all the time. You've read his stuff in the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and other places talking about fatherhood, gender gaps in education, and a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today. Richard Reeves, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, Russell. That really meant a lot.
While we were in the on-ramp to this conversation over the past several days, there was a news headline that I don't think would have been comprehensible just a few years ago, because no one would have known even what the words mean. And it is an online controversy about Clavicular, the online influencer who was being frame mogged by a fraternity leader at Arizona State University. And so it was calling into question his commitment to looks maxing. There's at least three of these words, maybe even more, that would have been hieroglyphic, just a little bit earlier to everybody, and might still be to everybody else. What is going on right now? I mean, before we get to these bigger questions of kind of masculinity, why do you think it is that when I started in ministry, if somebody came to me and said, I have a child with a body image problem, they were always talking about a daughter. And now, if I have someone who says, I have a child with a body image problem, they're almost always talking about their son.
Hmm. Well, it's been a huge increase in those disorders among boys and young men. I should say that I think what's actually happened is that it's been so common among girls and young women, that to some extent it's sort of baked into people's expectations. It goes against the grain to think about boys and men having these issues. And so I think it gets more attention for that good reason. But I don't want to understate the huge issues there are for women and girls, and the ways, in some ways, they've gotten worse because of these same online pressures that have led to these issues around things like looks maxing, for men. In some ways, I think it's a good example of how just the more online lives of young men and young women are influencing them in ways that are sometimes similar and sometimes very different. And your opening story about these different pastors dealing with different challenges, I think, does tell us that two things can be true at once. There can be many ways in which a lot of women and young girls are struggling now and need maybe one kind of formation, and other ways in which boys and young men are struggling and maybe needing another kind of formation. So I think it's just true that the risks are somewhat different for boys and girls, and for young men and young women. So it motivates my work, is to say, what are those differences? So another very topical issue, for example, which we're working on, is sports betting.
Mm-hmm.
And sports betting skews massively male. Right? If you want to look at the people who are going under and going bankrupt or struggling because they've gotten addicted to sports betting, it's overwhelmingly male. And so there's something about the risk there that is just very gendered. But if you want to look at some of the issues around like emotional bullying online and relational bullying online, it's clearly much worse for girls and women. Right? And so
Much worse for girls and women.
the relational bullying thing, yeah, just
Oh.
that sense of like, if you're in or out, people commenting on your, back to commenting on your appearance, your reputation. I mean, it's a trope, but it's true that boys are more likely to have historically bullied each other more physically than girls have. But that doesn't mean that girls don't bully. It's just that they tend to do it more relationally, through ostracism, etc. And so to be provocative about it, it's sort of the mean girls phenomenon, taken online and amplified. And so it does mean that these risk profiles are a little bit different for the two. But like, part of my whole frustration sometimes, Russell, has been people sort of feel like you have to choose, right? Are girls doing worse? Are boys doing worse?
Right,
Like,
right.
is it a man's world? Is it a woman's world? Has
Mm-hmm.
woke feminism declared a war on boys, or is there now a Trump-inspired war on women? It can't. It's just, and it's just like, actually, most people are just trying to raise their sons and their daughters and noticing that they might be struggling in different ways. But it is clear that in many areas, like education, employment, social mobility, etc., that on average the boys are doing worse and the young men are doing worse than the girls now. That's just true. It doesn't mean that there aren't gaps the other way, but right now, if I'm looking at a 22-year-old who is struggling and is lost, they are actually just statistically much more likely to be male than female.
Why is that the case?
Well, I think it's partly a cultural shift, and I'd be interested to see if you agree with this, having observed the changes. I did say we had these old scripts for men and women, many of which were kind of actually reinforced through institutions like the church, which is, you're the guy, you're going to be the breadwinner, you're going to be the
Mm-hmm.
provider, you're going to be the head of the household, etc. Right? Very, very tightly defined roles, scripted role. And for women, you're going to be a homemaker, you're going to be a mother, you're going to be a wife. And those scripts were clear, they were quite efficient. Everyone knew what to do and what not to do, but they were deeply unfair to women. And so what we did was we tore up those scripts and we replaced the old script for women, the script that my mum had, which was wife and mother. And instead, we replaced it with a new script, which is, you can be whatever you want to be. Girls on the road, black girl on the run, black girl magic, future president, you can do anything, future CEO. Very empowering message, which is to be independent and strong and autonomous as a woman, right? New script for women. And again, I love all of that. We also tore up the old script for men, of course, right? 40% of households now have a female breadwinner, right, as primary or solo breadwinner. That's 4 times as many as just back in 1979. So, like, the idea that you're the head of the household, the sole breadwinner, right, the patriarch, small p, if I can say that, like, that's also gone. But what did we replace it with? What's the new inspiring vision that we're giving to boys and young men for how to be a man in today's world? There isn't one. And so we've torn up the old scripts, replaced the one for women. We did not replace the one for men. And so as a result, no script. You're having to improvise. It's very difficult. You're kind of lost. And at worst, a lot of young men today say that they know what not to be. They're constantly being told what not to be and what not to do. But very few people are telling them what to be and what to do. And that creates a huge appetite, I think, for formation, for guidance, which is leading a lot of men online. And it's leading a lot of them to some pretty dark places as well as to some pretty great places.
I want to hit every part of that you just said, but I want to start with, do you think that part of the reason with this doing away with the scripts, I mean, did you have a little bit of a catch in your throat when you started working on Boys and Men of thinking, this might be really controversial with people who are saying, well, you're falling into gender essentialism and we ought to deal with people as people, not as gendered beings and so forth. Well, is that part of it? Is that it's very difficult to even say, hey, this is what a man is, even in general terms?
Well, particularly if you start to talk about a different prescription for masculinity, that's right. But even to do something much more mundane than that, which is just to point out that there's a bigger gender gap in higher education today than there was in the 1970s. It's just the other way around now. Like men are further behind women in colleges today than women were behind men when we passed Title IX in 1971, 1972, right? That's just true. 2/3 of the best performing high school students by GPA are girls now. There's twice as many girls in the top 10% of high schoolers as boys, opposite at the other end. These are just more, male wages have stagnated if you don't have a college degree. This is just true, right? Most tragically, perhaps, suicide rates among men under the age of 30 have risen by 30% just since 2010. And we're now losing 40,000 men a year to suicide. We lose as many men every year to suicide as we do women to breast cancer. So they're obviously very different, but I'm just putting it into perspective. So these are just like facts. And it's not just a catch. It wasn't a catch in the throat. It was an externally imposed strangulation when I first went down this kind of road. I mean, no one would publish this book. I was turned down by every publishing house in America.
Really?
Until the Brookings Institution came to my rescue and republished me, but nobody else would touch it. And that was interesting because, as you pointed out earlier, like 2 years later, Barack Obama put it on his summer reading list. So that's an interesting 2 years, right? From we won't even publish this to making it onto that kind of list. And what that told me was this is very difficult to talk about. And so you better talk about it carefully, and you better be fact-based. You better make sure it's positive sum. You need to ensure that this cannot be interpreted as somehow an argument for rolling back the opportunities or rights or resources of women.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an agenda that is looking at boys and men, but that is in any way seen as somehow against women, then you are quite rightly dead on arrival in most polite company. But because people were afraid that any work in this space would be seen that way, they didn't do it. And they warned me against doing it, which means the only people working on this issue are the people who have an anti-women agenda.
Yeah.
Right? So you just created this. And I was like, honestly, I said, if someone as boring as me, a Brookings scholar with charts and quoting Raj Chetty studies on intergenerational income mobility, if I can't write about it, then God help us all. So I thought I better write about it.
How much do you think this has been created by the way we teach, the way we do schooling? I mean, I'm thinking about, you're talking about this falling behind, and I have had educators say to me, we really have a curriculum and a methodology that is designed, generally speaking, not in every case, but designed toward girls and designed not to recognize when boys are falling behind. But there's no way that we can get around that because we have to now teach toward the test and things that are happening. How much of it is schooling?
Yeah, some of it is, no question. And the only bit of that framing I was just bridling at in the way you framed it there was just the word designed. And I know what you meant by it, or whoever you were talking to meant by it, but that could imply that it was somehow intentional, right? And yeah. I know you didn't mean that,
right?
I do think that school environments have inadvertently become more female friendly than male friendly. Right? Again, it's not a plot; it's not deliberate, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. One is just one obvious one is there's just very few male teachers around now. I mean, I think it's a striking fact about educational life that in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was president, 33% of our K-12 teachers were men.
Hmm.
So it wasn't half, but it was 33%. Now it's 23% and falling every year.
Hmm.
A 10 percentage point drop. There are more women in STEM now, STEM careers, than there are men in education. Right. So
Really? I
just
did
that's
not know that.
really, I think that's so important. There's a great phrase from the women's movement: "You can't be it if you can't see it." But if we don't want education to feel female coded, maybe it would be a good idea to have more men in education, right? So that's one change. Another change is that we've shifted away from more like hands-on or applied learning styles to more kind of abstract, test-based, etc., more abstract kind of reasoning, and that just skews against boys. Boys seem to do better when it's more applied. So, for example, career and technical education, technical high schools, just boys really get more benefit from that than girls do. It's not that girls, are hurt by them, but that learning style it is absolutely more female friendly than male friendly. And I think the other thing that's worth saying is that until we had more equality generally around gender, it was hard, I think, to really take seriously the fact that boys do just mature later than girls.
Yeah.
And I think we couldn't see the effect of that before because we were holding girls back, we were holding them down. But now we're no longer doing that, thankfully. I think the fact that like the average 16-year-old girl is older. And you've got boys, right? So you don't need me to tell you this. Like girls are just older than boys on average, at the same age, developmentally. And so I think that's a big part of it too. There's a maturity thing there that explains, I think, why the girls do just so much better in school than boys now, with the consequences that I outlined earlier. Again, it's just to emphasize the point. This is not a plot against boys. It's not a war against boys. It's just an inadvertent consequence of an education system that I'm afraid does end up treating boys like malfunctioning girls.
Well, someone was telling me one time about trying to figure out how to deal with their son, and they were saying, he's not a bad kid and he's not rebellious. It's just that he's 20 years old, isn't isn't going to school, isn't he's working but not in any kind of a career trajectory, doesn't really want to go out into the world and form friendships, doesn't even really want to drive. And my response to that was to say, well, how is it? I mean, I can see where all the factors would come into play, but how is that just basic biological drive to meet
Hmm.
people and what has happened to that?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's actually a really good example, I think, of the problem you alluded to earlier in your story of the youth pastors, which is that a much bigger problem with young men is that they're checking out rather than they're acting out. So the guys that act out, get the attention, etc. But like crime rates are down, antisocial behavior is down. Like there are fewer young men are less likely to act out today than they were 20 years ago, right? Physically, through kind of some sort of physical. They're not on the streets; they're in the basement, right? They're on screens rather than being on the streets. And that obviously will reduce crime and it will reduce all kinds of antisocial behavior. Right? You can see the effect of that, but it also means that they've retreated and they've retreated to a very significant extent online. And what you notice is that there's this kind of agency issue, right? Is that sense of what propels you into the outside world? What is the motivation to go out there and take risks romantically, take risks relationally, take risks in terms of employment, take risks in terms of education? Why go out there and take risks to try and succeed? And I think for this is where issues like pornography, which we might get to, and so on, really come into play. Which is that one reason, though, historically men have taken those risks is because they want to mate and
Hmm.
marry and have kids and succeed and so on. And if that doesn't feel like that's the path for them anymore, if that doesn't feel needed, then what's the motivation? I think a really deep question here is what motivates young men to do hard pro-social things? Because it is not obvious off the bat why they should. And
Mm-hmm.
every society has had to find ways to answer that question of what do we do with the men, and how do we channel male energy in a pro-social direction, right? And I just think we're being naive if we think we can be a society that doesn't have to do that. And so I think what's happened is a man, for example, calculating the risks of dating, the risks of asking someone out, the risks of whatever of the real world versus the easy path of pornography, say, or the risks of the labor market and trying to get promoted, especially from the bottom, versus the immediate satisfactions and status of video gaming, right? And we have to take quite seriously the fact that like that might not be an irrational choice in the short term. And so how do we motivate those men? How do we make those men feel like it is worth getting out? Well, I think that's the question that, candidly, as a culture, we're grappling with. And until recently, honestly, I think even to raise it as a question has been seen as something that puts you on the wrong side of the argument. But I think it is a question, and I think it's incredibly naive of us to think that we don't have to answer it.
Well, with at least two of those things, I think if we were to go back into a time machine to kind of a social conservative gathering in the 1990s, and the question of pornography or video gaming were to come up, probably what somebody would say is the more that porn is available, the more sexually libertine and anarchic men are going to become. And the more that you have these really violent video games, the more aggressive and violent they're going to become. And now it's almost as though if the same meeting were being held, we would be saying the reverse.
That's
That
exactly
it's
right.
not so much that it creates too much of a drive, but that it saps it away or helps to sap it
That's
away.
that's that's such an interesting observation. I think it's exactly true empirically, right? We've seen rates of crime, including sex crimes, go down as the consumption of pornography has gone up. We've seen violent crime go down as video gaming, including violent video gaming, has gone up, right? So the lines have gone the other way. And so I actually think it raises a much more interesting question, which is why is it that for the first time in human history, the presence of lots of disengaged and disaffected young men hasn't increased the crime rate? Because in every other circumstance in history we can find, having some disengaged young men just mechanically increases the crime rate.
Yeah.
We've seen the opposite, and I think the answer is exactly what you just said: it's the screens. And so people are really down on screens right now. That's a big thing. And Jonathan Haidt is a good friend of
Yeah.
ours, and he's on my board. But like, this is maybe a very unpopular thought, but like, what's the counterfactual here? If you had the same number of disengaged, disenfranchised young men and no screens, right?
Yeah.
What would they be doing?
Yeah.
Where would they be? And I think it's plausible that they would be on the streets, and that we would have seen some of the effects that we'd otherwise seen. So it's a very unpopular thought, but maybe to some extent the screens have saved us
So
from some
per,
of the worst social consequences.
so perhaps it's not so much that the screens are causing this as the fact that whatever is happening is then leading to more screens. Is that
Exactly.
is that right?
Exactly. I think that's right. I think that of course, to be a social scientist, it's bicausal.
Sure.
Sound incredibly boring, but I think that people misunderstand I think that the retreat to the screen is a symptom much more than a cause. And it has given young men, especially, a much more attractive place to retreat to than they would have had in previous generations, right? And it's easy to roll your eyes at this and say, oh, well, if he would just get off his parents'
Right. Yeah.
get out of the basement and stop playing video games and made something of himself the way I did when I was a young, all this
Hmm.
eye-rolling middle-aged stuff. I get that, but on the other hand, I think you've got to say, well, look, how have we created a situation where that is genuinely more attractive to them than
Yeah.
going out into the real world? And maybe what we've got to do is make the real world more welcoming, more upskilling, more inspiring to those young men. What's the real answer to the question to a young man? It's like, why should I? Why should I stop doing this amazing fun gaming and looking at porn rather than going out and living rent free? Like, sorry, give me the really good argument. And the old argument used to be because one day you're going to have to look after a family and be a breadwinner and raise kids and all of that, right? Is that the answer now? Because the women around them are doing better than them. So what is the answer to that question of why they should get off the sofa in the basement, other than just rolling our eyes at them? And I think that, so in some ways it's a symptom, and it's a symptom of a much deeper cultural problem than most people, I think, are willing to recognize.
That attitude that you're talking about is so common, of saying, when I was your age, I had already, whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
and I was
When
I
I was
was
a
married.
lad.
I was married at 22. I was, out on
Yeah.
my own before that, and so forth. But when you look at what's actually happening, I had all of these imaginative possibilities in my mind. I could look at the
Mm.
guy in my congregation who was leading the morning prayer, who'd been in the Air Force for 40 years and had developed his career and had his family. Or I could look at the guy who was the sales representative and had been working for the same company for the last 40 years, and could see what that would look like, and all of these various possibilities. Is it the case that for young men right now, that there's not only not as much opportunity kind of at the entry level of formation and vocation and so forth, but it seems so much like that could be getting worse, that there's not even an imaginative placeholder there?
Yeah, well, I love that phrase, the imaginative possibilities. What I worry about is a vicious cycle setting in here, which is if you retreat from those in-person communities, from church, from educational institutions, from the labor market, then you lose the opportunity to see those men and think, oh yeah, I want to be like him, or to see other possibilities. And then if you don't see those other possibilities, you lose the motivation to go after them, right? And so this retreat then becomes self-perpetuating. And so I worry a lot about that. And I think it's where churches and other institutions can play a hugely important role, which is to take the moral formation of young men seriously, to provide role models, to provide a script, actually, what's the discipleship of young men in a way that's compatible with gender equality? It's 2026, but it's also pays homage to the fact that you are still a man, right? And it is male discipleship. It's not just human discipleship, and of course it overlaps. So we could maybe get into that, but I agree that it's a huge problem. And what I will say is that honestly, the lack of open-heartedness towards struggling young men that I very often have encountered. I think it's gotten better recently, but I was at an academic conference not that long ago, and someone was talking about young men who weren't in employment, who weren't in education, who was, apparently living at home. And this guy said, "Yeah, I call them slugs." And everybody,
Slugs.
slugs, yeah, and everyone
Uh,
laughs, and it's kind of fine. It's sort of like, in some ways, the last acceptable slur, right? Is to kind
yeah.
of this guy's to talk about these young men this way with disdain, and with a huge amount of disrespect and lack of empathy. And as I said, I get where people are coming from, but what I see is a lot of young men who are struggling, and in many cases, searching. They are
Hmm.
searching, and maybe they're searching online, but if you look at the explosion, like even the stuff you started with around looks maxing, right? That comes from this whole genre online of how to improve yourself, right? How to look better, how to be fitter, how to be healthier, how to be more muscly, how to start your morning with a cold plunge, or maybe go to church, etc. Whatever it is, what I detect actually is a desperate hunger among a lot of young men for more formation, more guidance. I think that young men are themselves coming to the conclusion that they need more moral formation and they need more guidance, and they are looking for it. And so we should say, hallelujah, let's help you find it, rather than saying, oh, if these men would get off their screen.
Hmm.
Nothing I think is more guaranteed to drive someone away than to treat them with that amount of disrespect and lack of empathy. They need a helping hand, not just a wagging finger and an eye roll. And it just, I'm probably being more strong than I should be here, but I have found, even in polite society, the way that people talk about young men today is offensive very often.
When I'm talking to an audience, my fellow evangelical Christians, often people either want to hear everything is in a state of complete disaster and run for the hills, uh, or they want to hear everything has now turned the corner and we're headed toward revival. And so often you will have people who will say, well, isn't it amazing this huge boom that we have in young men when it comes to religion. We actually look at the data. You don't have that kind of a huge, massive boom. But what you do have is the fact that we seem to be losing men at a lesser rate than women, which I have never seen happen. I don't think has ever happened in the history of the Christian church where that has been the case. How much do the trends that you're talking about here feed into that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in your understanding of the empirical evidence. We published something by Ryan Berge, who I'm sure you know,
Hmm.
on this very issue, showing that just if you look at all these data sets, the idea of a huge turn of an increase in church going among young men just doesn't seem to stand up to scrutiny, or at least not yet. But you have seen this reversal, as you said, in the gender trends. And I have to say that whilst, of course, I think Ryan's right, and we published his piece, just anecdotally, I am seeing more young men in certain church environments. I just am.
Hmm.
And of course, there's a danger that they were always there and didn't see them. The way I think about this is that to the extent that there is even more interest in this issue, or interest in the sort of people who take this approach. I mean, you see, let's take two very counter examples, like Jordan Peterson,
Hmm.
more from the right, talking a lot about theology, talking a lot about the role of church, moral formation. Like huge, obviously had a huge following. And then I'm trying to remember the name of the seminarian, the Democrat who's running in Texas.
James Tallarico.
Yeah, again, sort of just really is on Rogan, and there's a lot of young men who are really. I see this in my own sons actually, even though even the ones who aren't, one is not religious at all, but he just really respects people who come at this from a unapologetically religious perspective. And so, what I think lies behind that is this desire for more structure, and a desire for more purpose, and a desire for an institutional scaffolding that helps you to grow. Boys don't just become men with the passage of time; they have to be turned into men one way or another. And I think there is a role there for institutions of moral formation, including the church. And I think a growing number of young men are aware of that. And even if they're not returning to church, I do think their attitudes to it are shifting because of this hunger. I think there's a genuine hunger there. And therefore, and there's one of the things I'm very interested to hear you talk about. I think that there's a huge opportunity, but also a huge contest within church environments to talk about, debate, disagree about, well, what does male discipleship look like?
Hmm.
And which kind of versions of Christian masculinity or Christian manhood are our young men going to hear in their men's groups and from the pulpit? And it's something that I'm doing a little bit of work with One America, Andrew Hanau, on this issue. I'm super interested in it. I've been thinking recently, I can't resist asking you this, Russell, but I was in church the other day and I was looking at Joseph and just thinking like Joseph's a really interesting figure in this regard, and I've been reading quite a bit about it. Like he doesn't actually say a word
Hmm.
in the Gospels, right? Never talk about strong silent type.
Right.
But just think about Joseph for a minute there, and think about what he had to go through with Mary, and then becoming the father anyway, and kind of teaching Jesus his trade, raising and protecting them. When he gets the visions to sort of keep his family safe, and you just sort of think about what a role model in many ways Joseph is, and actually very modern in some ways, right?
Right. Right.
And so. I don't know what you think about that. How do you think about these issues of male discipleship, particularly in the evangelical church?
Well, I wrote a book about Joseph as a
I
actually
did
as a
not know that.
in
I did not
exactly
know
the
that. I'm
in exact
embarrassed.
yeah, no, in
Yeah.
exactly those terms. Yeah,
Oh,
I do think
great.
that's true because you see there somebody who is essentially sacrificing in one way his entire future um, in order to step up for someone else,
Yeah.
for his wife and child, and restructures that entire narrative. So yeah, I do think that's definitely the case. I also think that one of the things that's really interesting about the whole biblical storyline is that many of these things are actually addressed. I mean, there's not what some people would assume a very flat sort of Bronze Age warlord view of masculinity, nor is there uh, a kind of kitchen floor mat vision of femininity. You have
Mm.
very complex. I mean, David is a warrior, soldier, and a
Hmm.
harpist at the same time. So
Yeah.
you do have a very sophisticated view of masculinity and femininity that I just don't think lives up to the stereotypes a lot of people have.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, but you get these books like Wild at Heart that Kristin Demers and
Yeah.
others, people who you know have written about. And so I agree that it's complex and it's therefore, for it's not that prescriptive. You can't just draw one script, right? Back to where we were a moment ago. But it's also clear that, and this is where I think the whole idea of like, complementarianism and stuff has got into such terrible trouble because it's adopted these narrow ideas. But in the process, what's been lost is the sense that there are some differences. And so I just think like how do how as a church leader do you negotiate a world where the differences are honored and real without drifting into a complementarianism that is based on an inequality, given, as you said, the nuance and complexity within the biblical narratives themselves. Like, well, so how do you navigate that if you've got a couple that's struggling with it?
Well, I think one of the problems right now is almost exactly what you described earlier in the more secular environment. You have people who sometimes are reluctant to address those questions. Kind of what does distinctively it means? What does it mean to be a man? Uh, for fear that that will somehow give fuel to the people who are misogynistic and but it actually the refusal to talk about those things actually fuels that and creates it.
Cheaply.
Because then you end up with people who are coming in and saying, "Well, here's the answer. Let's get rid of the 19th Amendment and not allow women to take up the offering in church." Those sorts of things that kind of come into a void where there's no conversation and no teaching happening at all.
I completely agree. It's interesting that it's playing out secular and religious, but I think this question, how should I be a man today, is a question. It's a question that my own sons have asked themselves in a very different way than I felt I had to, let alone my father. And there are answers to those questions from some very reactionary voices, for sure, but they are at least clear answers. And I think the problem has been that there's been too much squeamishness on the other side of the argument about even acknowledging that it's a legitimate question. And that's led us to this vacuum that you just described.
I talk about all the time this conversation I had one time with a young man who said to me, I'm wanting to follow Jesus, but I don't ever want to be in a relationship. I don't ever want to be married." And I was expecting that he would talk about I'm devoting my life to serving Christ, 1 Corinthians 6 and 7, and so forth. But that wasn't it. He said, I've never had a role model of a good husband and father. My parents' marriage was a disaster. Divorce hurt me. My grandparents, same way. All of the men around me. And I don't ever want to risk putting any other kid in that situation. And so I'm just not going to marry. And my response to him was to say, I'm 99% sure that you would not be putting a kid in that situation precisely because you recognize that you're coming out of abnormal and bad situations. Most people who replicate those things do so unconsciously and invisibly. But what would you say to somebody who says, "Look, I'm a young man, I'm starting out, but I've never had really good fatherly guidance at home or in church or anywhere else. And I don't know what it's going to mean to be a man in 2035. What would you say to him?
Mm. Yeah, well, I would first of all hopefully start with a huge amount of empathy for the situation he finds himself in. Secondly, like you, I would say the people who ask themselves these questions are the ones you need to worry least about, right? As you say, if he's asking himself the question, I think, but that guy will be a great father.
Yeah.
That would be my current guess right now, right? If he's that thoughtful and that introspective, then you'll be a great father, right? Or at least I should say a good enough father. Like, that great line from the child psychologist who did the attachment theory stuff, Bowlby. He says, like, you should never aim to be a perfect parent. You need to aim to be good enough parent. And so good enough parenting has been one of my mantras, right? Because you're going to fail, right? But good enough turns out to be really, really good. He would be great, I think. And I think the danger is I'm avoiding the question. I don't think so. Is that if that's the case, then as a society, what are we doing to envelop that young man in thick communities that actually do contain men who could be father figures? I'm actually working on fatherhood right now, so I'm thinking about this quite a bit. Like, think about the term father figure and how often you use that term is used compared to how often you hear the term mother figure.
Hmm.
And it is, I think, precisely because of some of this kind of fragility and brokenness around fatherhood that we've seen, is that you have had other men act as, quotes, father figures. In fact, one of our, Fred Riley, who's a board chair, wrote a brilliant piece for us. He didn't have a relationship with his father, came from a low income background, African American community. And he said the four men who taught me how to be a man, and it was his pastor, his scout leader, his school principal, and his coach.
Mm.
Right. And we have pictures of all of them, and he talks about each of them. And between them, those different men help to provide him with a kind of composite, right, of what he was lacking in his own life. And so what I'd say to that young man is, well, where are the men in the church you admire? Where are the coaching? Where are the other people in your life? But also, I would say something that I think we very rarely to say to young men in these situations: we need you.
Yes.
We need you. We need you to be a father. We need you to be a mentor and a coach. We need people like you to help raise the next generation. This is not like our tribe. Our tribe needs you. So let's figure this out, right? And I think that feeling of like it being whether it's almost like optional. Do they need me? Does anyone need me? Are my kids going to need me? Do I need to have kids? Does my tribe need me? That sense of like the tribe not saying to these young men, we need you, is, I think, at the heart of many of these problems. So I would start by saying, you'll be a great father, and by God, we need you to be a great father.
I could not agree more. And I'm going to ask the indulgence of my audience who they've heard me say this before. But one of the revelatory moments of my life over the past several years is our congregation. They were going to have a men's breakfast dealing with the issue of porn. And said, look, we want to have an honest conversation about this, and we want all of the men of our congregation, 12 and up, to be here. And so I said, my teenage sons, they're going to hate this. 7 a.m. in the morning. It's with a really awkward sort of topic, but they need it, and we're going to get them there. It turned out to be one of their favorite things of the entire year, and they still talk about it. And I asked myself why, and I realized why. It's because at that moment, the person who was leading it was not treating them like kids and as consumers. He was saying, hey, I want each of you men at the table to pair up and pray for one another. And so I could look over and see my 15-year-old praying for a 55-year-old who is saying, look, I'm having some trouble at work and with my marriage, and I want to be a better dad. And my son is praying for him. And what was being communicated there was, we need you. You actually need to step up into the leadership of this congregation. You're not just a kid that we're trying to shape. And it was really powerful. And wherever I see that happen, and I can look back at my own life and see how my church did that, there did come a point where it was, we actually need you now. That had more effect than almost anything.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that with me. I think that's right. And my understanding of the anthropology around this is that is really what a rite of passage from boyhood to manhood or communicates, which is, okay, we need you now. Now, you needed us before, but we need you to be part of the tribe, to step up, to communicate. And I think that it's especially true of young men, is that we have to find ways to communicate to them that the tribe needs you, this community needs you, because it's just a little bit less obvious to young men than it is to young women. Right?
Yeah.
That's why the rites of passage for men, and we're actually about to do some work on rites of passage, has been so important. Because at some level, at some very, very deep level, I think that young women know that the tribe needs them. Once they've hit puberty and become fertile, right? We can't reproduce without you, right? We don't necessarily need that many men to reproduce, right? But we need as many women as we can get. And so that's why I think that historically cultures have been very careful to find ways to usher boys into manhood. I think exactly as you say, through this message of "we need you." And I just had an encounter with a college president. I'll share this story where she's really struggling to attract and retain men on her college campus. And she went up to this young man. She's walking around, and she went up to this young man and sort of said, "How are you doing?" She knew he was struggling a little bit academically. How's class? And she said, "Well, do you need some mentoring? We could get you some coaching. Do you need some extra practice?" And what? She said, "Like, what can we do for you?" And he said, "You know what you could do? Just once in a while, you could tell me what I could do for you."
Mm, that's
You're
wise.
always coming up to me and saying, "Here, what can we do for you?" So actually, sometimes what I need to hear from you is that you need me.
Yeah.
How do I contribute? And it turns out that a lot of the evidence is that actually, when you feel like you're a contributor, you feel like you belong. It's very hard to feel like you belong to a community that you're not actively contributing to and that you're being told needs you to contribute to. And I think that what we're discovering is that that's a particularly dangerous message for young men to not hear, right? I think we say to young men, it's like, do you want to work? Up to you. Do you want to date? Up to you. Want to try actual real life sex or mating rather than porn? Cool. Up to you. I mean, we got it. If you want to do it, cool. Up to you. Right? That doesn't work. Right? We have to be more intentional about socializing and structuring that transition into manhood for our boys and men. It's one of the reasons I ended up doing this work, because I just feel too many people saying, it's kind of optional. I think if we end up in a society where men feel optional, we're in real trouble.
So how would you advise a church to implement rites of passage? I mean, we don't have bar mitzvah in a Christian context the way that that synagogues do, and really, I think, pretty effectively demonstrates and shapes. Okay, you're moving from one place to another in the life of the community. So, what could a church do to implement rites of passage that would do that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, some traditions, have confirmation as a really big, as a big moment, as a rite of passage. And actually, I've just written a piece for Comment magazine, on making men, where I talk about rites and rituals, and I talk about the year 1980 when I went from being a Cub Scout to a Scout.
Yeah,
And I also transitioned schools, and the school transition was just secular and bloodless, but the Cub Scout to Scout one was very ritualized. And also a bit later on became confirmed with some mixed feelings, to be honest. But there's no question that finding rituals and rites of passage is important. So if I'm a church leader and I'm thinking about this, I'm very, very intentionally thinking about ways to mark, like your 12-year-olds coming to that breakfast, right? And giving them leadership roles, assistant, acolyte to, why are the young men never the ushers in church?
right.
Why is it always the old people?
Yeah,
Like, how about saying, actually, we want people to young people to feel welcome, so we need a youth usher. What about the men's group? Why doesn't the men's group have like a vice president who has to be like, between the ages of 16 and 18? And that's something that they aspire to. I don't know. I'm making this up. And to some extent, I think as long as it's substantively true, I don't think the precise nature of the rite of passage kind of matters. You just need this graduated thing to aim for. And especially again for men, there's this nice story. Yuval Levin told me that when a lot of progressive synagogues decided they didn't need men for the minyan prayer anymore, she just said, "Oh, it can be anybody." It almost overnight became mostly women, and so I'm told that now some synagogues are sort of saying, "Well, maybe we need like half and half, right?" To kind of say we do still need some men to do this. And so what I think is just a hard truth is that actually we do need to create some male specific roles within the church community, as well as maybe some female specific ones. And that's where I think the churches, and why I'm so interested in it, have a massive head start. Because one of the very few remaining institutions where the idea of a men's group or a men's outing is not controversial is a church. Even in the most liberal Episcopal church you can go to, it'll have a men's group, right? Um, but that's a huge opportunity to say, okay, so within that male environment, how are we bring discipling our boys, and how are we giving them rites of passage? So I know I didn't give you an answer, but I think the fact that we should just be very intentional about the question is really, really important.
So if you were advising a church that says, look, we want to get ahead of this, we don't just want to address what's happening now. We want to kind of look at the future of our boys and men. And they asked you, if we start all over from scratch, should we do our Sunday schools and Bible studies for children with boys and girls together, or should we separate them out?
Well, I think that when they're young, my instinct would be that it's probably okay together. But as they get older, I think that actually it would make a lot of sense to think about, especially teenagers, having teen groups differently. Some of the issues you're talking about, I think, would be much better done potentially separately. So I think that's a really good way to think about this. Is whether to do it separately or not. But I'm just thinking out loud here now. But like, if you think about some of the roles right within a church, maybe just saying, well, for the boys and for the girls, maybe just sort of saying, okay, well, we want to make sure that we've got, at least one girl doing this, and at least one boy. So the
Yeah,
greeters, you need a whatever you call them, but make it
yeah,
the young male greeter as well as the young female one. Rather than just saying we need greeters, actually, I think designating it as a sort of specific role that we need a boy for, a young man for, will go a long way. So I think it's less about separating out entirely and more about carving out distinct roles. So it's a very interesting. You might not know this, but the University of Richmond, where I visited relatively recently, they actually have they're the result of a merger of a women's college and a men's college, and as a result of that, they still have like separate governance, student governance, and student counselling, and so on. And then they have co-ed classes. And as someone said to me, well, the great thing about this is that it means that we've got 50% of our student governance is men, which is the only place that's true, because only men. So I think I've really come to this view, which I don't know how socially conservative this view is, to be honest, but that actually we do need some distinct roles for men and women in churches and other environments. That we can't just, we don't get to equality through androgyny.
and I get this question a lot from young women who are saying, look, as I'm kind of looking for somebody in my life, what are the green flags that they should look for? How would a young woman, as she's looking to a 21-year-old guy, how can she tell, I think he's going to be okay?
Yeah. Well, I have all three of my sons are in their 20s, so I'd obviously start with incredibly kind and caring towards his father. Really takes good care of his dad. That's obviously, but I think there is something about, like, relationship with parents is important.
Mm,
But I would say it's really the thing I'm looking for is a combination of kindness and, let's call it, contest or
mm,
agency, right? You want them to be intrinsically like a kind person deep down, but you also want somebody who will contest you. It's someone who, to contend is a better word, contend with, right? Um, has agency, has ideas of their own that are not the same as yours, has their own interests, etc. I think there's a word in Welsh. My mother's Welsh, so I'm not fluent in Welsh, but I've heard a lot of Welsh in my life, and there's this word in Welsh which is hwyl, Hywl, hwyl. And what that means is, if you've got hwyl, it means you've got the wind in your sails.
mm.
So that's the literal translation. I used to hear it a lot from the touchline of the rugby pitches, but hwyl. And it's what two things I've always wanted from my sons is like kindness and hwyl. Because I actually think what I hear, I don't know if you hear this too, from a lot of young women is, look, I don't want him to be like a jerk, for sure. I want him to be kind, but I also want him to be my equal. And this even sounds weird to say this now, but like, I want them to have their own ideas, their own agency. I want us to be in like this. I want creative tension between us, right? And so
Yeah.
this is not a red flag. It's a green. The red flag version would be like, if you ask him like, "What do you want to do tonight?" and the only answer you ever get is, "I don't know. Whatever you want to do."
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a bad red flag. The green flag is when he says, "Okay, I don't agree with you about this. I want to do that, or let's do that, etc." Like, because I do sort of feel that one of the inadvertent byproducts of the women's movement has been to render too many young men sort of unwilling to contend with and contest with their female partners for fear that will somehow be seen as like misogynist or patriarchal. And it's not. It's just about,
Yeah.
having something about you. And I think young women really want young men who've got something about them. So if he never argues with you, I would see that as a problem. A green flag is a good argument.
Or it's somebody who's not. He's not only not saying, I don't know where I want to go, wherever you want to go. He's also not the one who's just going wherever he wants to go. He's the
And
person who's
dragging
able
you
to
along.
figure out what it
Yeah.
is that you will like and then suggesting it, you know?
But also, yeah, just organizing it, just like doing it, like having some
Yeah.
agency. Just it's like that question of agency is really, I think, what's coming out. He's got, got something about you, and you won't always agree. It'll be a bit bumpy, etc., along the way. But I think a lot of kind of young women, or they kind of want someone who will compliment, contend with, etc. They want an equal partner. They want someone who's shoulder to shoulder with them. They don't want a shrinking violet, and they don't want a misogynist pig. And sometimes it feels like that's the choice that young men feel that they've got. And that it's not the choice they've got, but is kind of too often what they hear. And it bumps like a little bit to your earlier question, which is if anything that kind of remotely seems like a kind of more masculine typed behavior is something that's at best an eye roll, at worst a pathologization is somehow toxic, then what we're effectively saying to young men all too often is like your options here are either abandon all of that masculinity nonsense, it's all toxic, and basically become as feminine as you possibly can, right? Because that's the goal. Or really lean back into those traditional patriarchal versions of masculinity, right? And if basically the choice that young men have got is between being toxic and being a girl,
Mm.
it's not really surprising that a lot of them are going to choose the first or give up altogether. And so we've got to find this way to have this really aspirational model for. I'm thinking about the idea of a masculine care ethic a lot now, right? The idea of care, but in a masculine coded way, and just be okay about that. And my experience
Mm.
over the last few years has been the hunger for a good faith conversation about this and a solutions forward one about this is just absolutely massive. No, almost nobody wants to go back to a world where it was trad wives and patriarchs. Almost no. I
Yeah.
think there's a lot online. You might think there's a lot of them. There's
Yeah.
almost none of them, but nor are there actually all that many people who think that we should just move to androgyny.
Yeah.
Right. And there's no differences between men and women. And that's just, honestly, that's just crazy talk. Right. And so we're all figuring out what's the middle ground here.
Do you worry I mean, I think about as a pastor, when I would we had at one point a church I pastored had a factory down the road. A lot of men work there. Whenever there was even the rumor that there would be layoffs, I just knew I'm going to have a lot of drinking problems and marriage problems, and all of these things are going to happen with that. And certainly when there actually were these layoffs and men who'd been working there for a long time didn't have anything to do. When you look at kind of the technological changes that we have happening over the next several years, where people are talking about, should we have universal basic income, with jobs being replaced by AI and robots and so forth. Are you worried about whether we're ready for that when it comes to men and boys?
I am worried about that. But I don't know how that's going to play out in terms of gender, to be honest. I would say that the current evidence is very clear that male identity, this comes back to your factory idea, is just more tightly interwoven right now with jobs and employment. It just is. That may change. That may be different 20, 30 years from now, but it just absolutely is. And so what that means is that to the extent that like men have actually borne the brunt of a lot of the changes in the economy, that's bad for that sense of themselves as men. And I think it's just too quick to say, well, that's because they've got these outdated breadwinner ideas. If they just abandoned them, then they wouldn't care if they had a job or not. Because it's not the real world. It's also not the world that most women want their men to be in either, right? What women want is to be with a man who is still a provider, if not the provider, right? It gives them choice. So it just hits men very hard psychologically. I think in the short run, we might see more female jobs going in some ways because a lot of the kind of administrative roles that tend to skew female are actually, I think, really very, very at risk from artificial intelligence. But in the long run, I actually think I do worry that these healthcare jobs and education jobs where you do need like real people doing them, they skew very female. So one of the reasons I'm anxious to get more men into healthcare and education is precisely because I think those jobs are likely to be more protected from these technological changes. We have learned the hard way that just kind of decanting millions of men out of work is just absolutely terrible for our communities. And I don't think even the most strong feminists would disagree with the evidence on that now. And so we have to find a way for both men and women to share the labor market in a way that's more equitable.
I know a lot of young men who are kind of the opposite of the withdrawal that we were talking about. They, if anything, are too driven, and so you have guys who are just really hard on themselves with. This is I'm going to work out for this amount of time at this particular time, and then I'm going to go to my job and I'm going to succeed there, and then I'm going to do my Bible study for this amount of time per day, and they have this really, really demanding sort of regimen and expectation about themselves. And sometimes with some of them, I say, look, you're actually doing a lot better than you think you are, and you don't need to be as hard on yourself about this. If you were advising one of those young men and said, look, here's something for you to be a healthy, flourishing man, here's one discipline that I would say you should really, really concentrate on rather than everything.
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's in some ways good news, of course, that so there are those men who are kind of more aspirational. It's just that sometimes you go online, you do get this extreme sense of kind of discipline, and they overdo the stoicism or they misread what stoicism is, right? They're so sort of that they kind of they'll probably go to the other extreme. I honestly think it comes back to relationships and just spending time in real life with other people. Like the thing that I actually think prepares you for and to some extent inures you to the risks of the world, etc., is friendship.
Mm.
And so just be like, if there's one discipline, if we can call it that, or practice that I kind of advise young men is build, cultivate, and treasure your friendships. Like, I think that just it gives you. I've even seen it, like you may have seen this in my own sons. It's just the way that their friends have helped them out in hard, been there for them in hard times, helped them through good times. As I speak, one of my sons is driving across the country with a friend to start his new life in LA, having helped him bought the car, and then they're going to set up in the apartment. And they've been through some ups and downs, these kids, for sure. But there's almost nothing makes me happier as a father than knowing that my sons have friends. And I also think that friendship is how you learn a lot of the relational skills that you're then going to use in marriage and in those other relationships. So hone your relational skills if you want to use this language through your friendships. But I think it's something that we haven't been very good at, which is to build, cultivate, and treasure male friendships. So if you're going to do one thing as a result of listening to my advice on this, it's pick up the phone, call your friend, go see him, go watch a game together. So easy not to, but it's always worth it. Always say yes to a friend.
That's a good word. Richard Reeves, author of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Such a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Russell, and thank you for your work.